Centuries ago, before the invention of Twitter, interpersonal conflicts and rivalries were settled not with hurtful words, but with physical confrontations known as fights. Few people still alive today remember these barbaric times, and fewer still know what was actually involved, though some surviving records seem to suggest a kind of interpretive dance. The closest we'll ever get to this lost art of unarmed combat in these isolated times is the fighting game. By studying such historic documents as Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter II Turbo, we can better learn about these long-lost champions of times past, and, in turn, a little bit about ourselves. Is the Hadouken in fact a common human trait we've simply forgotten? What was Muhammad Ali's fatality? In this video, I will answer none of these questions. My name, as ever, is not important. Number 10. Marvel v Capcom 2. It's now a fighting game tradition for publishers to smash together two franchises of varying popularity in an attempt to have a successful property lend its credibility to a smaller, lesser known IP. Some of these mashups, however, seem to have been born from the kind of mentality that speaks directly to fanboy gamers. Oh my fucking god, the publishers say. That thing you love? And that other thing you love? What if, like, they had this big, massive fight? Well, thanks to Marvel v Capcom 2, players get to see who's best, from a roster that spans your favourite Marvel comics, and some you didn't care so much for, and your favourite Capcom games, and some you haven't heard of. Released in something called an arcade back in 2000, as well as for Sony PlayStation 2, Microsoft Xbox and Sega Dreamcast over the following couple of years, Marvel v Capcom 2 is a 2D game in the Street Fighter style, with pixel art sprite characters against an in-engine 3D background. After choosing your 3 characters from the pretty extensive roster by the standards of the time, you play in a tag team against your opponent's trio using some pretty insanely high hit count combos and entertainingly OTT specials. As mentioned before, the choice of playable characters covers what were at the time cult classic Marvel heroes from their beloved comic books and cartoons, so don't be surprised that MCU favourites like Black Widow and Thor get bumped for comic book classics like Psylocke and Gambit, neither of whom were particularly well represented on screen as of 2020. On the Capcom side of things, in addition to the expected cast of Street Fighter alumni and remarkably low turnout of Resident Evil and Mega Man characters, is a veritable who's that of 90s Capcom games. Marvel v Capcom 2 looks a little dated to modern eyes, and not just because its lineup is stuck in the 20th century. While pixel art is in style right now, Marvel v Capcom 2's sprites are a bit too low resolution to be timeless. The 3D backgrounds polish up nicely, especially in an emulator, but the interface looks like a 90s Nickelodeon website, and the music is almost bad enough to be good, but not quite. Looking past its imperfections and instead admiring its fast-paced gameplay, responsive controls and huge variety, Marvel v Capcom 2 is an incredibly fun fighting experience. Sadly, owing to various IPs changing hands over the years, we may never see a true remaster for modern systems, but anyone with a decent PC or a high-spec Android phone can give it a try on the Redream or Raycast emulators, and if you haven't played it already, I would highly recommend it. Marvel v Capcom 2 holds a Metacritic score of 90. Number 9. Dead or Alive 2 Hardcore. So, fighting games aren't generally known for their maturity, as the previous entry showed by being essentially the gaming equivalent of smashing your toys together in the playground. The Dead or Alive series entered a fighting game market in the mid-90s that was catering almost entirely to young boys' bloodlust. In order to better distinguish itself among a genre packed with all the blood and guts you could ask for, the original DOA took the 3D fighting game formula established by Sega's Virtua Fighter and added female characters with some rather unique defining attributes. For the follow-up, 2000's Dead or Alive 2, developers Team Ninja outdid themselves with what were considered some of the highest quality graphics among fighting games of the time, taking full advantage of the latest arcade hardware and Sega's Dreamcast home console. This graphical prowess was put to ample use, further enhancing and uplifting the characters with a higher polygon count, and added a fuller, more rounded storyline. This rather dramatic story of revenge and betrayal was delivered in Japanese with English subtitles by the game's anime-inspired characters, which apparently found something of an audience among a certain niche of Western gamers. Of course, DOA 2's quality wasn't only skin deep. Team Ninja really cared about what was underneath too. Many more serious gamers who presumably bought DOA 2 for the articles found it to have a fully fleshed out combat system with a series of throws and holds in addition to normal attacks. DOA 2 also pioneered the extension of game stages outside the normal arena, with characters able to be thrown through barriers in the map to reveal additional scenery. This added level of complexity over other games helped uplift it over the competition of the time. Different versions of the game had varying amounts of content, with the original US Dreamcast version lacking the full range of playable characters and stages, and the PlayStation 2 version having launched with lower quality graphics. The hardcore version, launched on PS2 a few months later, fixed the issues with the initial launch and provided the best way of playing DOA 2 until the Xbox launch years later. Despite its juvenile appeal, later cemented by some questionable releases in the series, the press saw DOA 2 as one of the best fighting games available at the time. This version holds a Metacritic score of 91. Number 8. Super Smash Bros. Melee. Nintendo are a sweet, innocent bunch who would very much like to know why we can't all just get along. I mean, the SNES version of Mortal Kombat famously shipped with blood and fatalities removed, so they certainly wouldn't dream of making a bloodthirsty first-party fighting game. That being said, Team Mario have never shied away from an opportunity, and the fighting game boom of the 90s and 2000s was too big for Nintendo to ignore. The first Super Smash Bros. Game released in 1999 for the N64, followed by Super Smash Bros. Melee on the GameCube in 2001. This follow-up extends the already hefty roster of first and third-party heroes such as Mario, Peach, Zelda, Link and so on, and adds more game modes, notably the single-player adventure mode that, while not really a story per se, gives players something to do when their friends suddenly stop visiting for some reason. Like other games in the series, and unlike most other fighting games, Melee presents the option for 4 players to fight on a single screen at the same time, thus lending itself to parties, especially among people who don't really value the longevity of their friendships. The goal is a little different from your average fighting game. Instead of beating an opponent to submission, Smash Bros. Lets you inflict as much damage as you like onto your opponents, with the aim being to launch them off the screen until they have no hope of return. Combat could be summed up as easy to learn, difficult to master. Despite this apparent simplicity compared to, say, DOA 2 released the previous year, there is a considerable amount of strategy required to perfect a Smash Bros. Melee game, with learning combos and moves being replaced with a more frantic, movement-based playstyle. In a multiplayer level, the map layout presents the biggest challenge, with levels tending to shift and move throughout the round to avoid anyone getting too comfortable. For the completionist, not only does the avid player have a whole host of 26 characters to unlock, they have a vast number of trophies to collect as well. Some are random drops, others awarded for specific actions or achieving milestones, and most can be acquired by the lottery system, basically a loot box purchased with in-game Smash coins rather than real ones. To the Nintendo fan, this is a veritable treasure trove of nostalgia and provides vast amounts of replayability. For everyone else, this is a bewildering array of content that will pretty much just make you want to give up and get on with the next item in your top 10 fighting games list. Super Smash Bros. Melee was one of the most highly regarded games for the GameCube, both among critics and the gaming public, with almost one game sold per console. Despite its casual-friendly design, Melee still remains popular on the esports scene to this day, and is worthy of its 92 Metacritic score. Number 7. Soul Calibur 2. Namco's secret weapon in the fighting genre was, of course, a big fuck-off sword. In this case, it's the Soul Edge, a giant living blade with an eye in the middle that eats souls and joins the ranks of those found in Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII and Silent Hill 2 for the most impractical melee weapons in gaming history. It is this sword around which the story of the Soul Calibur series revolves. Set in 16th century Europe, it's unfortunately just a lot of nonsense about stealing souls and vengeance, and I'm not going to pretend I was following. Like preceding titles, Soul Edge and Soul Calibur 2 was an absolute jaw-dropper, with incredible graphics and presentation for the era. Character models have high polygon counts, texture maps are rich and detailed, and environments are fully 3D rendered and gloriously colourful. Although for a weapons-based fighting game series there's a curious lack of blood and dismemberment, there is still some distinctly non-child-friendly content. This time around, Namco had taken a leaf out of Team Ninja's book with some decidedly risque character designs and some very specific physics enhancements. Though the fact that we never saw Soul Calibur Beach Volleyball is apparently as low a bar as we're going to set here. Gameplay-wise, there's enhancements to combat mechanics without sacrificing the previous game's sense of 3D freedom. Characters can now unlock access to additional weapons, each of which have subtle differences to default ones. Arenas are more varied, and the single player mode has more content too, including the expanded Weapon Master mode. In truth, while the game offers plenty of enhancements over the original game, the real attraction at the time was accessibility. Soul Calibur was an arcade port that, in its default state, was too intensive for home consoles, and as such the only home release was some years later on the Dreamcast, an excellent but notoriously unpopular console. Being a big seller on Dreamcast was like being the most eligible bachelor in the monastery. 2003 was, however, a whole console generation later, and Nintendo's GameCube, Microsoft's Xbox and Sony's PS2 were all more than capable of running arcade quality games, and as such Soul Calibur 2 was simultaneously released across all three major platforms. With this expanded audience, Soul Calibur 2 truly kicked off the franchise and earned an aggregate score with critics of 93. Number 6. Street Fighter Alpha 3. No list of the top 10 fighting games of all time would be complete without the legendary Street Fighter series. Street Fighter 2 in particular can be credited with inspiring many tropes that would go on to define the fighting game genre, such as making everybody forget the first game in the series, producing a mind-boggling variety of versions of the same game with minor differences, and finally arriving at the point, the spin-off series. The initial spin-offs of the mainline Street Fighter series were Street Fighter EX, a now largely forgotten 3D game in the style of upstarts Virtua Fighter and Tekken, and Street Fighter Alpha. The Alpha series continued in the 2D pixel art style that the franchise had become known for, leveraging the power of newer hardware to increase the pixel count, animation quality and colour depth. More than ever before, Alpha's visuals were like playing a live anime on a home console. Street Fighter Alpha 3 released in 1998 in arcades and on the Sony PlayStation, and in 1999 was ported to the Dreamcast. However, the visual quality, in particular the fluidity of the animation, didn't quite match that of 1997's Street Fighter 3. That game was deemed too demanding for home consoles at the time and wouldn't release until 1999, which was a year after Alpha 3's console release. From a gameplay standpoint, Street Fighter Alpha 3 adds a series of new mechanics like the ability to block while mid-air, a guard system that reduces a player's defense the more they block, and the ISM system, allowing players to customize their approach to combos according to their preference for the Street Fighter 2 style of play or for the Alpha series version. For those who care about the story in fighting games, the Alpha series acts as prequels to Street Fighter 2, featuring younger versions of fan favourites, as well as some characters from older titles like Final Fight. Alpha 3 represents the last full title in the Alpha series, and if one were looking to rationalise its existence, serves as some comfort for those Street Fighter fans who hated the fact that Street Fighter 3 had removed almost all of the established franchise characters from its roster. Depending on the version of Alpha 3 you own, you'll have access to plenty of classic characters from Street Fighter history, with only a couple of new additions for this release. Normally I'd say this is perhaps a detriment, but given the reception to Street Fighter 3, well, perhaps one can't blame Capcom for playing it safe. Street Fighter Alpha 3 was critically well regarded for the time and earned 93% on Metacritic, despite launching at a time when interest in 2D fighting games was in a marked decline, so critical praise didn't quite match with popular opinion. As such, Alpha 3 really only gained popularity at the time with the Street Fighter faithful. If you're enjoying the list so far, why not perform the like, subscribe, notification combo down below. Cheers! Number 5. Super Smash Bros. Brawl. I feel like this is likely to be controversial. I've been aware of Super Smash Bros. For a while and played Brawl on a friend's Wii back in the day, but only in researching this list did I find out just how passionate Melee fans are. I reference Scott the Woz's video on just how strongly some people felt that Brawl was a massive disappointment and virtually lost the entire competitive gaming crowd's support immediately. To the uninitiated, Super Smash Bros. Brawl is an enhancement of the Smash formula in every way, with newly polished graphics and higher resolution to take advantage of the new console hardware. As you'd hope, there's also a bigger choice of maps and characters, and with fewer of these additions being cheap reskins of other characters. The Wii's motion controls don't add much to the experience here, as controls haven't really changed much since the GameCube, though fans would argue that simplicity of control is one of the series' defining attributes. There's new game modes, though arguably some of the additions are actually more like rebrands of existing modes. The single-player game is now substantially extended with the Subspace Emissary, an evolution of Melee's adventure mode, and a weird Deep Space Nine reference now I come to think of it. With a story told through a frankly excessive number of cutscenes, some of the minigames have been simplified, and really that's about it. Multiplayer returns, this time adding online functionality and associated lag that comes with every Nintendo game, but Smash Bros. Remains a game best suited to breaking up friendships in person, rather than pissing off strangers on the internet. Where Nintendo have really outdone themselves is the collectibles. Trophies were a big part of the previous game and have only been increased with Brawl. This time joining the trophies are stickers, which beyond being cosmetic also provide stat boosts. So far so good. Smash Bros. Brawl is everything you'd want from a sequel. More of the stuff you liked, more aesthetic improvements, and more reasons to keep playing. What's not to like, eh? Well, if you're the less casual kind of gamer, it turns out there's quite a lot to dislike. It seems that during development, Brawl's creators added a few mechanics that add some chaos to the mix. Specifically, the trip mechanic, aka the Smash Bros. Equivalent of a blue shell, means that even the most skilled players can find themselves randomly sent crashing to the ground, taking a few moments to recover. Add to that the poorer character balance and lower frame rate, and you'd get yourself a real major league disappointment for MLG. For almost everyone else, however, Super Smash Bros. Brawl is a delight, and the reviewer community rewarded it with an aggregate score of 93. Number 4. Virtua Fighter 4. Virtua Fighter was a series I sort of didn't expect to see in the top 10 fighting games of all time. My personal experience with the series didn't extend much past the first two games, which in hindsight felt kind of like a tech demo for the concept of 3D fighters rather than fleshed out games in their own right. Nevertheless, the early Virtua Fighter games arguably gave birth to the 3D fighting game genre, and presented a great option for gamers who preferred its more technical, stripped-down style compared to the more fantastic elements of competing franchises, with minimal service paid to the idea of story. By Virtua Fighter 4 in 2001, the series that had always marked the cutting edge of what was possible in arcades once again displayed state-of-the-art graphics, with high-polygon character models, realistic lighting, and detailed textures. Releasing on PS2 the following year, the game became known as one of the most user-friendly fighting games out there. While casual button mashers could get enjoyment from the game, you were also rewarded by taking the time in practice mode to learn combos, throws, deflections and strategies to gradually improve as a player. Gameplay features standard options like the arcade mode, multiplayer bouts and notably the Kumite tournament, the latter mode allowing players to unlock customization for their chosen characters, as well as allowing you to follow your own statistics as you progress. This comprehensive approach to gaming made for a complex, layered game with fans among the casual audience and the more competitive market. Compared to other fighting games, Virtua Fighter 4 is more grounded. There's nothing in the way of fantasy fighting mechanics, and even jump heights are more realistically acrobatic than previous titles in the series. About as far from reality as the game gets is the return of boss character Dural, a martial arts cyborg who learns your fighting style as you play. Evolution from previous entries didn't extend as far as story. As before, it amounts to a group of fighters, each with their own backstory and motivation, entering into a fighting tournament. And that's it. For an arcade title, this is about as much as anyone needs, as they aren't exactly environments conducive to a cinematic storytelling experience. However, as arcades slowly gave way to home gaming, particularly in the West, this bare-bones approach to narrative wasn't going to remain relevant forever, and the franchise effectively died after the long-delayed 5th entry to the series. Virtua Fighter 4 was universally well received on release, with the PS2 version accruing a Metascore of 94. Number 3. Street Fighter 4. After some false starts with the mostly forgotten Street Fighter EX series, Capcom finally released a Street Fighter game using polygonal characters instead of sprites in the form of 2008's Street Fighter 4. In common with previous entries in the main Street Fighter series, Street Fighter 4's combat remains 2D in execution, regardless of the technique used to create the graphics, with the only concessions to 3D space coming from some camera moves when characters trigger their super combos and ultra combos. This has been termed 2.5D, with the 3D graphics used instead purely for practicality, utilising 3D meshes with textures and shaders to emulate a hand-drawn aesthetic, along with fluid animation and customization that, although new and different, were identifiably Street Fighter. This visual style was later continued within the series, emulated by competitors, and these days is pretty commonplace, with games like Dragon Ball Fighter Z blurring the line between 2D and 3D animation completely. The arcade version of the game includes a roster of 16 playable characters, from series favourites to a handful of new additions, along with one unlockable character in the form of Akuma. The first home console release extended this to 9 unlockable players for a total of 25, and after several other intermediate versions, the final release, Ultra Street Fighter 4, featured a fully unlocked lineup of 44 playable characters. Street Fighter 4 doesn't break the mould in terms of gameplay options. Your expected fighting game modes are here: single fights, story mode, training, and multiplayer, including online play. In gameplay, Street Fighter 4 was designed to be a continuation of Street Fighter 2, mixing old school controls and combo systems for the existing fans with some welcomed new features that made the game feel fresh and new. Rest assured, your series favourites are probably here, and their basic movesets and super combos will likely be the same as they were before. However, the standard move and combo list have been bolstered further with the aforementioned ultra combos. These have their own meter separate from the super combo, and once successfully employed, gameplay stops momentarily to play a brief animation while the combo lands. The general feeling about Street Fighter 4 at the time was that, after a few mishaps along the way, this was the game that corrected the franchise course and could win back old fans as well as create new ones. The critical aggregate score for Street Fighter 4's initial home console release came to 94, earning it joint third in the top 10 best fighting games of all time. Number 2. Tekken 3. The undisputed champion of the 90s 3D fighting game boom, Tekken overcame its handicap of sounding like a Northern English version of a Liam Neeson movie to become an overnight sensation. Born from the idea of taking Virtua Fighter style gameplay and adding more Street Fighter style fantasy elements and a dramatic story all of its own, the original Tekken spawned a series which continues to this day. Tekken 3 was the last release in the series for the original Sony PlayStation and was hugely innovative and influential for the time. The game went all in on presentation, with not only incredible graphics but also lifelike animations that really sold the idea that you were controlling martial arts experts. This level of polish didn't start at the game either, with an intro movie and cutscenes that rivaled, well, not good movies, but certainly matched the CGI you saw on TV in the late 90s. Gamer expectations in 1998 were very different from what was expected in 2000. So, even though compared to Soul Calibur on Dreamcast or Tekken Tag Tournament on PS2, this is a bit of a blocky mess, at the time, this was mind-blowing. Core gameplay was largely unchanged from the previous games in the series, though Tekken 3 did finally make some use of the third dimension with a sidestep mechanic, but the main notable change was the addition of the Tekken Force mode. Not to imply that Force wasn't applied in other modes, I mean it's not like the other modes were Tekken suggestions. Instead, Force mode took your chosen character and placed them into a side-scrolling beat-em-up in the style of Final Fight, Streets of Rage et al. At the time, this beat-em-up genre was teetering on the edge of irrelevance, so this was more of a cute wink at gamers rather than a serious addition, but still it comes up on every article about the game written online, so I thought I'd mention it. The character lineup was a radical change. Like the previous year's Street Fighter 3, Tekken 3 made the bold move of pushing the timeline of the series along further and either replacing or aging up the entire roster. This gamble seemed to pay off as many of the characters established in Tekken 3 went on to become fan favourites. While in a context of a world that's seen Tekken 7, Mortal Kombat 11 and Street Fighter 5 take the combat mechanics, graphical fidelity and story melodrama to incredible heights, 1990s 3D fighting games look frankly awful and amateurish by comparison. The games industry was smaller in 1998 and the fighting game was a bigger proportion of it. So when a game looked this much better than what had preceded it, that made teenage kids use words like awesome and rad like the fake kids on TV shows did, it's no surprise to find that the critical hyperbole was every bit as excited for Tekken 3. The press as a whole awarded Tekken 3 with an aggregate score of 96, handing it the silver medal on the fighting games podium. Number 1. Soul Calibur. It's difficult to imagine looking back how big of a deal 3D was in the mid-1990s. Aside from spawning the entire first-person shooter genre, see my top 10 FPS video for more on that, the 3D revolution caused the developers of existing genres to fundamentally reconsider how their games were played. Many fighting game developers used the added dimension as a gimmick, replacing 2D sprites with polygons in order to keep up with the current trend. Even popular titles like Virtua Fighter, Battle Arena Toshinden and Tekken, while implementing 3D space in which characters moved, didn't really make the best use of this space, with movement mostly limited to two directions: towards and away from. Soul Calibur was perhaps the first successful title to fully realise the potential of 3D fighting games. First released to those arcade things in 1998 and later to Dreamcast in 1999, Namco's follow-up to their decidedly more pedestrian Soul Edge boasted not only some stunningly modelled and animated 3D characters, but also implemented 3D environments, at a time when some of its competitors still used exclusively pre-rendered backgrounds. Moreover, Soul Calibur was innovative in allowing free movement in any direction within the arena, which, when combined with direction-based attacks, added a literal extra dimension to combat. Horizontal attacks were used to increase your chance of connecting, but were less powerful than vertical attacks. This extra freedom brings with it peril, however. The borders of the arena usually result in a hard drop, meaning a round can end immediately if one of the players were to plummet to their doom. This is not only an additional obstacle for players to contend with, but also a potential strategy. However badly a player is losing, there exists the possibility that they could force or lure their opponent into falling over the edge, resulting in a ring out and a win by default. Soul Calibur's presentation extended to its story and cutscenes, with an intro cinematic that eclipsed much of what was on the market at the time, and, at least in direction and style, echoed a music video or movie trailer. The story, told through cutscenes and storyboard-style animatics, tends towards the anime-style melodrama and centres around an evil sword and various characters' relationship with it, whether they want to possess it or destroy it, all that nonsense. The Soul Calibur series may have declined in quality and lacks the uniqueness it once had, and this first title, apparently nobody counts Soul Edge anymore, was truly a groundbreaking title in the fighting game genre. Critics and gamers alike applauded it at the time and for years after, meriting a massive 98 score on Metacritic and heralding it as the greatest fighting game of all time. And that's my list. How surprised were you that Street Fighter 2 wasn't here? How about Mortal Kombat not showing up even once? No Guilty Gear, no King of Fighters, no Injustice? Why not curse me, Metacritic and the whole world for ignoring your favourite fighting games down in the comments below. And while you're down there, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.